Thank you for joining us for this evening's program on democracy and authoritarianism with Anne Applebaum and Larry Diamond. I'm Claire Noble, the Director of Programming for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. We're in our 49th year of convening locally, thinking globally. Two items to be aware of before we get started tonight. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option for Q&A. Please type your questions in there at any time, and we will share those questions with our speakers later in the program. We'll try to get to as many as time permits. Tonight's program will run until 6:50. It's being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to take just a moment to thank the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Jeannie and Dale Mosier have underwritten the winter season. Cindy Ingalls has underwritten the geopolitical series. Tonight's program is underwritten by Gabrielle and Bill Mimless, Laura Temperi, and Carol and Pete Feisman. And the Vail Symposium is also supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Thank you to all of our donors. And if you'd like to become a donor and help us continue to offer thought-provoking programming, please visit vailsymposium.org to donate. Please make plans to join us a week from tonight on Thursday, February 18th at 6 p.m. when we welcome journalist Emily Taguchi. She's a producer for Nightline, and she is also a producer of the award-winning documentary After Parkland. Coincidentally, this Sunday marks the 3-year anniversary of the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, in which 17 children and their teachers lost their lives, and another 17 were injured. This has been in the news recently as video footage surfaced of Parkland survivor and student David Hogg being harassed by now Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Again, that program occurs on Thursday, February 18th at 6 p.m. Now we turn our attention to a discussion of governance, democratic and authoritarian. Our distinguished guests are Anne Applebaum, who's a staff writer for The Atlantic and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. She is also a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Agora Institute, where she co-directs ARENA, a program on disinformation and 21st century propaganda. A Washington Post columnist for 15 years and a former member of the editorial board. She has also worked as the foreign and deputy editor of The Spectator magazine in London, as the political editor of the Evening Standard, and as a columnist at Slate, as well as the Daily and Sunday Telegraphs. She's the author of several award-winning books, including Gulag, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction in 2004, and was also a National Book Award finalist. Larry Diamond is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He also chairs the Hoover Institution Project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region, and is the principal investigator of the Global Digital Policy Incubator, part of Stanford's Cyber Policy Center. For more than 6 years, he directed FSI's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, where he now leads its program on Arab reform and democracy. He's the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy and also serves as a senior consultant at the International Forum for Democratic Studies of the National Endowment for Democracy. His latest book, Ill Winds: Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency, analyzes the challenges confronting liberal democracy in the United States and around the world at this potential hinge in history, and offers an agenda for strengthening and defending democracy at home and abroad. I'm going to turn our program over to our speakers, but just a reminder again for our audience, please use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen to share questions with tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Claire, and welcome everyone. It's such an honor to be able to share this virtual stage with Anne Applebaum, someone who I admire so much. And Anne, I'd like to thank you by way of beginning, not only for all the great writing you have done in your monumental book, Gulag, and all your other books and essays and columns in the Washington Post and the Atlantic, but especially given the subject tonight, I want to thank you, well, with my virtual background, it's not showing, for this remarkable book I want to talk with you about tonight, Twilight of Democracy, the Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, and also for writing a relatively short book that one can get through quickly, and such a movingly personal book. And if anyone hasn't read this book yet, I highly, highly recommend it to you. So, Anne, let me begin where you begin your book, with the New Year's Eve party in Poland at the turn of the century, 21 years ago, that hopeful moment, a decade after the fall of communism. There were so many Poles with whom you had found common cause over a long period of time in resisting authoritarianism and ushering in a democratic system. You had formed many friendships, you and your husband, Radek Sikorski, who we should let the audience know is a major liberal democratic political leader in Poland, and would go on to serve a decade as Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs in Poland. And those people, a number of them broke with you and your husband and democracy in quite a shocking way. So the first question is, why did they succumb to the authoritarian temptation, the lure that you describe, and what is this lure, or what you also call the authoritarian sensibility?
So first of all, thank you, Larry. It's a great pleasure to virtually share a stage with you. Larry's a great scholar of democracy and has been writing about these things for many decades, and I hope everyone reads his books as well. And I'm happy to be here. I wish I was in Vail and that I was going skiing tomorrow morning rather than appearing from a temporary apartment in Washington, D.C. But we can't have everything in this world, and so here we are online. Larry has just asked the question, which is the main question of my book, and although it's a short book, it took me, I don't know, several thousand words to answer it. I'll try and do it briefly. I mean, the starting point, the turning point for my book, the reason why I wrote it, was that 10 years after I gave this New Year's Eve party, I mean, the book is not about parties. It wasn't a fancy party. It was actually a little bit of a chaotic party. But 20 years later, sorry, when I started to think about it, I realized, as Larry said, that about half the people at the party we no longer spoke to. But this wasn't personal, because about half the people at the party no longer spoke to the other half of the people at the party. And these weren't personal disagreements, they were political. And we had gone in very different directions. And I realized that I had lived through one of these intellectual turning points, these moments when there's a big political shift. And I tried to think how I would write about it. I mean, that kind of shift, that kind of attraction to new ideologies is something I'd written about before as a historian, or even as a journalist, as an outsider. But I realized that I wanted to describe it from within, because I'd lived it, I was part of it, I was implicated in it. As Larry says, my husband was a politician in Poland. Some of the anger at him was directed at me some of the time. And so the story could only be told in the first person. I wasn't going to pretend that I was an objective journalist or that I was writing on the basis of archives. It's a first person story. And the book actually doesn't just do Poland. It talks also about the US and the UK and several other countries, and it looks for patterns. But the very first place I started to look at was Poland. And this is, to be clear, who was at our New Year's Eve party in 1999? It was nobody famous or important, certainly not at the time. It was mostly, there were a few American and British friends, But it was mostly Poles, and they were mostly people who'd been, roughly speaking, anti-communists. I mean, not even roughly speaking, I mean, that's what they were. They were somehow connected to the Solidarity trade union movement, or they were Solidarity journalists. Some of them were a little young to have been important in that movement. Even my husband was a little young. He was in, sort of opposition in high school and left the country after martial law in 1981. But they were people who agreed that they were anti-communist and who roughly agreed that after communism, Poland should be a democracy, that it should join the European Union, that it should be, roughly speaking, it should have free markets. And in 1999, there wasn't really any big argument about those things. There were some arguments about other things, but not that. 20 years later, a part of the group had rejected what Poland had become, because actually 20 years later, Poland, by any sort of objective statistic, was incredibly successful. I mean, it became part of Europe, the European Union, it became part of NATO, it became a successful democracy with periodic elections and a free press. It had a vibrant civil society. And also it had an extraordinary economic record. I mean, people doubled and tripled and quadrupled their wages. If you look at standards of living in 1999 compared to 1989, they were already much better than they had been. But certainly by 2009, and then by 2014 or 15, it was, Poland was a huge success story, and people were already beginning to write books about how Poland was a huge success story. So what was it that they rejected? What was this group of people angry about? And it's a complicated story. As I say, you need to look at particular people, but in general, this was a story of disappointment. Sometimes it was personal disappointment. Poland had become, had become a place where I am not personally recognized, and my intellectual talents or journalistic skills are not financially or in other ways rewarded. The political parties that I chose to join after 1989 did not succeed. I did not become prime minister, which is what I thought I would be, because I was the leader of the student movement in Gdańsk in 1987. And so there's an element of that. There's also an element of, once Poland had actually achieved this place that it had wanted to be, people looked around and say, wait, this isn't what we wanted. We imagined something different. We had a more utopian vision of what the country would be like. And also, by the way, haven't we lost some things? Didn't we lose some sense of closer community? Didn't we lose traditional hierarchies? What is all this feminism that we seem to have imported from the European Union? What is this thing about gay rights? That wasn't part of what we were fighting for in 1989. And there is an element of that was real, in that, yes, it's true that things were lost in the transition, even as things were gained, just as modernization and rapid change always means that things are lost. And then on top of that, there was an element of propaganda. People began to see, yes, this, gay rights and feminism, this is something you can use to anger people and inflame them and set people against each other and use people's resentment. And then some of people that we know became very involved in the propaganda, in the sort of far right journalistic world, and began to see that these were themes they could push, they could focus on, they could get people to concentrate on, and that this was a way to power. This was a way to. So it's a combination of personal and political reasons. I mean, I don't ever want to say that nothing real wasn't happening. There was a real sense of loss. There was also, for many people, there was a sense that, their children had gone abroad, they'd lost some sense of continuity. My child's childhood isn't the same as my own. There were more opportunities, but also more breaks in people's lives. And so people felt that. And then there were people who intuitively saw that you could build a program on this, and you could build a program of resentment on it. And that, I think, was the beginning of the ascent of, it's hard to know what to call it in Poland, this kind of nationalist, Catholic, traditionalist right, which bears some resemblance to the far right in other places and has some little unique elements of its own.
Right. Now, why would a nationalist, Catholic, traditionalist right, say social conservative, They want a more maybe traditional role for women. They particularly don't like gay rights. Why would it represent such a direct pathway into a deeper, more political illiberalism in terms of the hegemonic agenda that the Law and Justice, now ruling party in Poland, has pursued? An agenda that's, as you write, and I agree, pretty authoritarian, even though they haven't had the votes to amend the constitution in the way that Viktor Orban has in Hungary.
The answer is that they aren't a majority. They don't have a majority. They never had a real majority. I mean, they won a parliamentary majority, partly because the opposition is very divided into smaller parties. But they don't have a real majority in the country. And now increasingly on some issues, they're very much in the minority. On, for example, the issue of abortion rights. Abortion is essentially banned in Poland, but recently it was constricted even further so that women who were giving birth to a damaged fetus would be forced to carry the baby to term. And that offended a lot of people. It's a very unpopular decision that was made by their packed court. They politicized the constitutional court. And it's precisely because they're in the minority, and this is a problem we know from our own country, that they need to be authoritarian. I mean, if you know you're on the losing side, if you know that your views are unpopular, then what you need to begin to do is you need to be able to skew the electoral system. You need to be able to play games with courts. You need to attack the free press. You need to, change the calculus so that you can continue to stay in power. So it's partly about that. It's partly because, in addition to having this ideological goals, they also have financial goals. It's an extremely corrupt party in multiple different ways, and their corruption has been exposed. And one of the ways in which you cover up corruption, again, is by controlling the courts, controlling the prosecutors, and controlling the media. And so, this is a drive for power. I mean, to some extent, you have to sort of look from person to person. Some of the party members are very ideological and they believe in this, as I said, nationalist Catholic agenda. Some of them I believe to be totally cynical. I don't think they believe in anything at all, but they are interested in money and they are interested in power. And so, a one-party state where you don't have real competition or where you can use the levers of political power to make the playing field uneven, as I said, this appeals to them because they, then they get to stay in office. So I think that's the answer.
And of course, in a different context, you might suppress the voting rights of African Americans as part of that agenda.
There is a similarity with how a part of the Republican Party sees itself in the United States. It sees that, because it's attached to itself to a, sort of demographic, ideal and an identity rather than a set of political ideas. And it fears that identity is in danger. One of the ways it's going to seek to stay in power is by repressing the votes of other people, by gerrymandering, by trying to change the rules. I mean, it's, in that sense, it's a very bizarre thing to say that, the idea that Poland and the United States have anything in common politically. I mean, they're nothing in common historically, nothing in common culturally. Yet there is this, because we're talking about two conservative parties that have gone down a similar road, you can see some parallels.
Well, that is a beautiful segue into my next question. Of course, it's not just Poland, and it's not just the United States in some respect. Before this trend began, at least in terms of government and power in Poland, it began in Hungary with Viktor Orban's return to the prime ministership in 2010. And now for the last 6 years, we have a similar dynamic, I would argue, in India in a very alarming way, with some pretty similar features in terms of cultural conservatism, misuse of nationalism, and of a chauvinist expression of the dominant religion, and so on and so forth. So there's something broader going on, both in the post-communist world that you've been living in, and in the world. You're a historian. This seems to be a historical moment If you date it back to Orban, that's now 10, 11 years. If you date it back as far as I do, or as the Freedom House data does, it's more like 14 or 15 years. So why did we have so much promise in the first 15 or 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and now, a decade or more of pretty increasingly worrisome retrenchment?
I mean, you too are a historian of democracy and a close observer of democracy. And with famously, democracy has often been described as coming in waves. There's a series of democratic transitions, and then there's a backlash. And Samuel Huntington's famous essay described 3 waves, and we're now on the backlash against the third wave. And so maybe that's the deeper pattern. I mean, but I do think that the question of why is this happening everywhere all at once? And why is it so similar, in India and the Philippines and Poland and Hungary and the United States and Brazil, countries that, as I say, nothing in common. You cannot draw a line. You cannot find a similar economic situation. You can't find historical parallels, nothing. You have to ask what else is it that's happening in the world that has made this kind of politics possible and popular. And one of the conclusions, various people have come to different conclusions. My conclusion is that it's very closely related to the rapid and dramatic and revolutionary change in the way we communicate. And this is partly about social media, and social media has been talked about a lot, and I talk about it a lot in the book. And the way it's changed the nature of political campaigns, but I think it's also deeper than that. It's part of the way we now get information and we learn about politics. I mean, even if you think of something as simple as your smartphone, and the way most people see the news now, or they see information, something pops up. Oh, that's a message from my cousin, about dinner next week. The next thing that pops up, it's an advertisement for hairspray. Third thing that pops up, oh, there's been a coup in Burma. Which of those things is important, and how should I pay attention to them, and what's the hierarchy of importance? And I mean, that's one piece of the story, that we've the news world is very flat, and there's a lot of information now, enormous amounts of it, and sorting your way through it is very complicated and confusing. And in this world, people who have very simple, straightforward, clear messages have often been very successful. If you think about, one of the things that I talk about in the book is the Brexit campaign. And the British situation is a little bit different from the others. I don't think Brexit was entirely anti-democratic in the same way that, that other populist parties have been. But the tactics of the Brexit campaign were amazing. It was amazingly similar. What was the slogan that was so successful? The slogan was "Take back control." In a world where you are losing control, where there's so much information you don't know what's going on, where your national government seems to not have as much power as it used to because of global markets, because of the European Union, because of the internationalization of the news, which means that things that happen on the other side of the world now suddenly affect us here in England. That was a very simple and very effective slogan, and it had a lot of impact. And if you look around at the messaging that works, it is very often about control, about, make America great again. What was that about? That was return to a simpler time, an easier moment when we knew what the hierarchies were, we knew what the rules were, we didn't have all this chaos. And again, why do we think we have chaos? Because we see chaos all around us. I mean, anybody who's watching the news or who's watching, looking at the internet, has the impression that we live in a world of total chaos. And this is not, by the way, to suggest that there aren't also economic reasons for these movements, and that they demand economic explanations as well. But I've just become a little bit skeptical of those as a complete explanation, simply because of the point that you brought up. If we're talking about India, the Philippines, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, America, and Brazil, then we can't talk about a single economic explanation. It's also true that many of the people attracted to these movements, these far-right movements, are not the poorest people in society. So the poorest Americans did not vote for Trump. They voted for Biden. The the most impoverished, Indians are not necessarily voting for Modi. I mean, so it's the explanation needs to be more complete. I also think that, we tend to like economic explanations because they imply a clear solution. Oh, the problem is inequality. Let's just have higher taxes and more redistribution, and that will fix it. Whereas, I mean, and maybe we do need to do that. That's kind of separate issue, and we can have another conversation separately about economics. I'm just worried that that's not the full explanation, and that ignores many of the things I started by talking about. The loss that people feel in rapid modernization, the glut of information that makes people feel confused and lost, and leads them to desire simple ways out or simple paths. And by the way, this is part of the appeal of conspiracy theories as well, that have been so important in the United States in the last month or two, because they offer complete explanations of complex phenomenon. And so therefore, I would really point to this change in the nature of information. And also would say one more thing, which is that if you look back in history, every time there has been a major change in the way that information flows, you have had a major political impact from that. Whether you can start with the invention of the printing press, which led, I'm squeezing a lot of history into 5 seconds, but it led roughly to the Reformation, and the Reformation, which created, kind of the polarization of its time, and led to, 100 years of Catholic Protestant civil wars in Europe. So huge, enormous impact from the ability of people to read and write in much easier ways, and the end of the monopoly, of information from the monasteries. Similar thing, you can talk about the invention of the radio. In the 1920s, it was also very quickly the first people who really learned how to use radio effectively, and who were both obsessed with it, actually, were Hitler and Stalin. I mean, they were aficionados of the radio. They cared about it. They knew how to use it to reach people, in their own homes. And it was really only later with the invention of, the BBC and public broadcasting and regulation of radio, as well as Democrats like FDR learning how to use the radio, that democracies learned how to fight back. And I think we're in a similar phase now, where authoritarians have learned how to use social media, how to weaponize it, how to use slogans, how to reach people who are most anxious and most distressed by rapid change. And we haven't yet had we haven't had the moment of reflection and regulation and counter campaigning, which I hope will come next.
Well, I will simply note that you keep anticipating my questions, so thank you for answering the question I was about to ask. And in wanting to ask it, I do want to share a quote from your book, which I was going to ask you to elaborate on, but you just did. The emotional appeal of a conspiracy theory is in its simplicity, and then, as you said, in its totality as well, which is very alluring. You have a line in your book, and that particularly resonated with me. I must say, so many of them did. It's an incredibly well-written book. But I think Madeleine Albright expressed something similar in her book, which is also, I think, a very important contribution, Fascism, a Warning. And you wrote, given the right conditions, any society can turn against democracy. So you've kind of spoken about many of those conditions. I wonder if you want to elaborate, but I don't want to end our conversation and go to the Q&A, which we'll do in about 6 minutes, without asking you how we immunize ourselves against that danger. We thought we had strong institutions, we had expanded voting rights, we had civic education in the United States. We prided ourselves on the fact that we respected the Constitution and the rule of law. Poland and Hungary were admitted to the European Union, and to its founding principles and treaty. Mission accomplished. So that didn't work out so well. So speak about the broader vulnerability and how we get immunity from vulnerability.
So first of all, I mean, I don't know whether this is good news or bad news, but there's no such thing as immunity from vulnerability. And actually, the founders of our country knew that. And when you read what they were writing and thinking about, in 1789, when they were thinking about the US Constitution, they were very focused on the failures of democracy in the past. And actually, for them, what they were reading was the histories of ancient Greece and Rome. And I just recently gave a lecture about this because I find it so fascinating. George Washington at Valley Forge put on a production of that was a sort of history of Cato's life, Cato having been a Roman senator who wrote about the decline of the Roman Republic. They all knew the works of Cicero, although usually in a kind of popularized, 18th century, almost kind of pop fiction form. He was sort of popularized writer at the time. And they were very focused on the fall of Rome and why it had fallen and preventing the rise of a Caesar. And when Alexander Hamilton writes about, fearing the coming of a tyrant, that's what he's thinking of. And you can see it even in the kind of language he uses. And so they knew that democracies can fail. And one of the reasons they constructed our sometimes unwieldy and awkward constitution the way they did was because they were trying to protect the new nation against this danger. So they knew it. And, later in American history, people knew it. I mean, the Civil War was a terrible catastrophe for American democracy. But we were, our generation, my generation, and, our Larry and my generation, I think we're seduced by the incredible and unusual success that we had really starting in 1945, because the story of from 1945 even to 1989 is also a story of democratization. First Western Europe and then Southern Europe, Spain and Portugal and Greece become democracies. And, and then we have this spectacular moment in 1989 when the communist world, much of it winds up choosing democracy. And so seduced by this really unusual moment, many decades of democratic success, we imagined it would last forever. And the truth is that democracies do rise and fall, and they can decline. And there is no perfect immunity. There's no thing that we can do or law that we can pass that can protect us. What I'm hoping the last few years have been is a kind of warning to people to remember that, in fact, the future is radically open. I am not saying that democracy will decline or disappear. We might have a huge revival of it. Right. I'm not saying that nor am I saying that it will, go one way or the other. I'm saying that it's always constantly up to us. The decisions that we all make every day and the degree to which we are engaged in our own society and in our own institutions, whether we're engaged in local or regional or national or state or institutions and societies and whether we vote, whether we contribute. I mean, that all continues to have an effect on whether we succeed or not. And democracies require constant reform and constant change. I mean, you mentioned civic education. I don't think civic education does work very well anymore in America. Maybe it needs to be less boring. Maybe it needs to have an online version. Maybe it's something that should be, maybe there should be internet campaigns to teach people about the separation of powers or the role of the Supreme Court. Maybe we need some reforms to the way Congress works to make Congress more effective. I mean, you're somebody who campaigns all the time for different kinds of voting systems. You've worked on ranked choice voting. I know. I mean, but those are, the institutions that we have do shape the way we vote and the way we campaign, and it makes the outcomes of our voting different. And thinking very hard about some of those changes and thinking how we can make them in a bipartisan atmosphere is something we may need to do. I mean, I'd almost hope maybe you can help me answer this question. I mean, there are a lot of people thinking about institutional change and political change that can help us. I don't want people to either be totally in despair or totally optimistic. I mean, there's this wonderful, it comes from Martin Luther King, and then Obama used it, but it's almost a kind of mantra in America. The arc of history bends towards justice. we have this idea that we can be on the right side of history and that we don't really have to, because we've made these right choices, it's all going to go well just because history is always positive. I mean, that's not true. I mean, the arc goes the other way some of the time. And whether it can be saved depends on the investment that all of us make in our own country.
Well, it's so eloquently put. I wouldn't want to mess up this portion of the conversation by trying to add to it or modify it. Claire, why don't we turn to some of the many questions that have been accumulating?
Thank you very much. Before I do that, I do just want to show everybody Anne's book and also direct you to the very first post in the Q&A. You'll find a link there to where you can buy Anne's book at Amazon.com. In your book, when answering the question as to who might be drawn to a demagogue, you draw upon the thoughts of Hannah Arendt and Karen Stenner to provide a description or traits of the authoritarian personality. And we do have an audience question about, okay, so who are these people? So I'm hoping that you could address that for the audience. But I also want to throw in a little bit of wrinkle, and that comes from the Washington Post that points out that 60% of the people who've been charged in the Capitol Hill riots had financial difficulties, such as unpaid taxes, bankruptcies, and the like.
So thank you very much. I mean, yes, I do talk a little bit about, there was this idea coming out of Hannah Arendt and then later some of her followers, and in later years, that there was such a thing as an authoritarian personality. There was a type of person who was naturally drawn to authoritarians, and she wrote about radical loneliness and people who were cut off from others, and she had a vision of why this was possible, mostly coming from her own experience coming out of Nazi Germany. Since then, others have worked on this idea, and I use the work of Karen Stenner, who's a really interesting kind of behavioral psychologist, who talks about not so much an authoritarian personality, but an authoritarian predisposition. That there are people who in certain circumstances can almost be triggered by, or drawn towards authoritarianism in some moments. And it's really a more useful concept because it doesn't say that some people are just genetically born that way. And, you have I don't know, it's like you have a mole on your left shoulder, therefore you're an authoritarian. I mean, it's not something that you can recognize like that. But she says that there are people who very much intuitively dislike cacophony and chaos, this kind of information, madness and disorganization that we were talking about before, and who are bothered by, who are particularly bothered by polarization when there's a lot of noise, and who therefore seek simpler and more straightforward answers. And her argument is that type of person exists everywhere. They're in all societies, and she believes, I didn't go into this at length in the book, that it's therefore the job of liberals or liberal politicians to find ways to make them comfortable in liberal democracy in a world where there is a lot of political difference and demographic difference and ethnic difference, and to somehow find ways to make them fit in. And that's, she sort of argues that it's incumbent upon the liberals to do that. I mean, I know that's an argument that frustrates and angers a lot of people, particularly at the moment. But I've tried to write a little bit about that myself. I've seen a lot of statistics now about people at the Capitol. One interesting point is that they tend to be older. They were mostly middle-aged, which is I think part of why the rhetoric of nostalgia is appealing to them. Another statistic is actually they were mostly middle class. So again, they don't come from the poorest parts of America, at least the majority of them didn't. That they could be middle class and yet troubled. Many of them seem to be, in particular, had lost businesses or jobs because of the pandemic. And so, so you have a kind of not, again, impoverished Americans, but middle-class Americans who felt themselves to be somehow excluded or to be slipping, or to be somehow dropping out of, where they felt they should be, or they didn't have the status that they thought they should have, or they hadn't had the success that they, again, I'm very careful, but I don't want to overgeneralize because, we're talking about thousands of people and there were a lot of them there for different reasons. And I don't want to, overdo that, but there is a pattern of, and this again goes across many countries, of disappointment. I didn't get what I thought I should have in this meritocratic society. I should be valued more. The system is rigged against me. Other groups, other ethnic groups, or other classes are somehow blocking me from what I deserve or from my natural path. And this kind of mentality does lead very quickly towards, particularly in the direction of conspiracy theories as well.
And I might add that theme just comes through like a laser beam in Arlie Hochschild's remarkable book, Strangers in Their Own Land, where she planted herself in the Bayou country of Louisiana, interviewing many of these kinds of people. And in a remarkable work by the Wisconsin political scientist, Karen Kramer, which doesn't get as much attention, but really should. It's called The Politics of Resentment, Scott Walker and the Rise of Rural Consciousness, which I also highly, highly recommend. And they're all of a piece feeding into the direction, the sociological phenomenon that I think Anne is identifying.
Yeah, the one thing that was really authentic about Donald Trump, he lied a lot about everything. I don't want to talk about him at length, but the one thing that was authentic about him and that I think people got from him was his sense of grievance. Mm-hmm. I have been unjustly treated, even though he was a billionaire and he was, wealthy and successful and so on. He transmitted this sense of, I am not sufficiently appreciated. New York society is looking down on me. The New York Times has been mean to me. These high-ranking institutions don't accept me. And he had that going back 20 years, and he transmitted that. And I think that was one of the things that people found attractive to him, because he reflected some real sense of grievance.
Well, our next question comes from Tony, and it builds on this, but it really wants you to address whether or not this desire for authoritarianism and this appeal of conspiracy theories comes only from the far right. I think in your book, you address that, some of this same sentiment can be found in left-wing campuses trying to control speech, for instance.
Look, I wrote 3 books about Soviet communism, and so, long books. And so, that there is a parallel phenomenon on the left is absolutely the case. I mean, what was Bolshevism but a massive conspiratorial? They had a class version of it. We are being oppressed by the ruling classes and so on, which was equally based on false stories, and had a in some ways very similar patterns. I mean, I'm always struck by the ways in which the modern radical right and the old-fashioned radical left have so much in common. And there's even a bit about that in the book, even in the American context. They use some of the same language. Steve Bannon uses the language of the old radical left in strange ways. And so, yes, there is that. And of course, there is always the potential, for radicalism on the left. And there is I have some trouble seeing an exact parallel to the right on college campuses, because it's mostly right now, and this could change, but mostly it's a cultural rather than a political phenomenon. It's actually not reflected in the ruling Democratic Party. I mean, Joe Biden is not a product of the campus left, and neither is Nancy Pelosi. In a way, even some of the most left-wing members of Congress, I mean, even AOC, Ocasio-Cortez, is a more nuanced figure in person than some of the campus radicals who have these very strict speech codes and want you to talk in a certain way and so on. I mean, so I don't see them as the same level of threat right now. I mean, certainly they could be, and certainly there is there's a strain of historically, there's been a strain of intolerance and authoritarianism on the left too. And of course, these same, the same cacophony and the same distress and the same sense of being overwhelmed that draws people to the radical right is also drawing some people to the radical left. And so, I think that the sources of radicalism and the sources of that deep discontent can be the same in both sides. But I just didn't see them right now as similar problems. Maybe we'll have this conversation in 5 years and I'll feel differently about it.
You write that when people have rejected aristocracy, the argument about who gets to rule, who's the elite, is never over. And, in our lifetimes, both the legislative and executive branch have changed hands multiple times back and forth. So in the United States, is there a struggle between elites and counter elites? Who are these counter elites? And I mean, if it's, some branch of the Republican Party, they've been in power. So I don't understand why they're struggling in this way.
There is a lot of fake talk about elites in America, because of course, yes, we do have different elites, the Trump and the thinkers and journalists and spin doctors around Trump were all elites. They were. Laura Ingraham went to Dartmouth and was a Supreme Court clerk. And she's a leading, authoritarian populist spokesman on Fox News. Many of the people, in that orbit were well-educated at, at whatever you think is good education, Ivy League schools or good state schools. Many of them are people who are well-traveled and sophisticated. And so some of what we've seen in the last few years was a battle of, one, as I started out by saying, a kind of one discontented group of elites who felt they weren't sufficiently rewarded against, another group of people whom they thought were elites. And so this was there is no formula by which Trump is not a member of, one of the wealthiest groups in America, whether or not he's really as rich he says he is. He did have a Manhattan apartment with gold taps. So, most people don't have that. So what we were watching was a war among elites, even though it wasn't, there was this phony, anti-elite rhetoric that's used by extremely wealthy multimillionaires like Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham or Steve Bannon. Even though they were using that language, they are clearly part of a counter elite. So, but yes, the questioner is right. We start with the problem that we don't have a natural elite anymore. There's no aristocracy. There's no king or monarchy who's been blessed by God, who's legitimate because God says he's legitimate. We don't have a theocracy. And so that means there is a constant battle. The reason we have a democracy is that democracy enables that battle to take place within a set of rules. And what's dangerous about authoritarian, anti-democratic language and tactics is that it attacks the rules. What was the riot at the Capitol about? That wasn't Republicans against Democrats. They were there. That was a group of people who were attacking Congress, and who were trying to stop Congress from fulfilling its constitutional duty to name the next president. And they were looking for Mike Pence, who they wanted to kidnap or worse, and Nancy Pelosi, and Mitt Romney. So this was an anti-systemic group of people who were attacking the system itself. And as I said, the system was designed to make some kind of healthy and rule-based competition among elites and the public possible. And what they were doing was attacking that system. And that's why it's such a particularly dangerous movement.
Well, we're just about out of time, and I told you I would give you the last word. So I'd like to start with Larry and then give Anne the actual last word. And I'm just hoping you will frame this on what's the key takeaway tonight for our audience in your mind on this topic. Larry, we'll start with you.
Well, for me, it's Anne's, I think, really fundamental point. Take nothing for granted. I think one of the most important things she said is that the future is dramatically open. I don't remember your exact language. it reminds me of one of my favorite political speeches of all time is John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, where he talks about the extraordinary, sobering challenge. And we were facing the Soviet communist monolith, the danger of nuclear war, the march of revolutionary and totalitarian movements, armies and ideologies. And he said, "I do not shrink from this challenge, I welcome it." I think that's a direct quote. And I think that's the way we should view it now. Anne has laid out, I think, much of the deeply sobering danger we face, but in every danger, there's an opportunity. And for young people, I think a very inspiring opportunity to become engaged and defend, renew, and improve our democracy and help other people do so around the world.
I would finish by saying, you know, if we made a big mistake in the last 20 or 30 years, the mistake was to assume that politics was something that happened somewhere else, you know, that, you know, we can just get on with making money or writing novels or going running, and we can leave politics up to the professional politicians and their slightly boring and world and their specialized language, and we can let them worry about it. And, you know, Washington is something that happens over there and real life is over here. It's really important for citizens of democracy to remember that, you know, you may need to be more involved in making sure that your society works than you thought you had to be. It may not be something that you can just leave to other people to do or delegate somewhere else. You might have to give some time or some money or some thought or some, you know, some conversation with friends and relatives. You might have to be engaged in ways that you didn't expect to be. And I would say that would be the you know, the message that I'd like to leave everybody with.
Thank you both very much. And thank you to our audience at home for joining us. I hope we'll see you back here on February 18th when we welcome Emily Taguchi. And for those of you celebrating the Lunar New Year, I would just like to say in my terrible Chinese, 新年快乐 and 恭喜发财. And thank you all very much. And again, hope to see you here next week. Larry, Anne, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.